December 1944. The air was cold, crisp, and filled with a biting wind as the small group of German women shuffled into the American prisoner of war camp. Hilda Neumann, the eldest among them, pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame, her breath visible in the freezing air. Behind her, Erika Jaeger kept close to Magda Reinhardt, the two women exchanging glances that spoke volumes, fear, confusion, and disbelief. None of them had anticipated this. Captured on the retreat from France, they had been moved across countries, herded into trains like cattle, and now, in the dead of winter, they found themselves in a foreign land, facing what seemed to be an even colder future. They had heard of the Americans, but had no true understanding of them beyond the propaganda they had been fed. This was supposed to be temporary, just a means to an end. They would be sent back home to Germany, their task completed, and the war would eventually be over. Yet, as the women stood before the tall wire fences of the camp surrounded by armed soldiers, it was clear that nothing would be the same again. The camp was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of footsteps on the frozen ground. The women's hearts pounded in their chests, their minds racing to comprehend what had just happened. They were no longer part of the war effort. Now they were prisoners. It was difficult for any of them to grasp this new identity. They had served the Reich in various capacities, nurses, clerks, and communication specialists, but here they were all equal, helpless, hungry, and at the mercy of the enemy. As the gate to the camp creaked open, the women were ushered inside, their feet dragging along the muddy ground. Hilda, despite her exhaustion, held her head high, trying to maintain the composure she had learned in the auxiliary corps. She looked around, but all she saw were barbed wires and watchtowers far removed from the familiar fields and homes of Germany. It was Erika who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" She turned to Hilda, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Do you think we will ever see Germany again?" Hilda hesitated, the weight of her own uncertainty sinking in. "I don't know," she murmured, "but we must survive. We must do whatever it takes." Magda, the youngest of the group, had been quiet up until now, her wide eyes darting from one soldier to another. She clutched the small bundle of belongings she had managed to keep, the few personal items that had survived the journey. Her hands were trembling, and she couldn't shake the cold, even as they were escorted to a nearby barrack. As they entered the room, the other prisoners, mostly men, stared at them in silence. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. The reality of their situation had set in. They were no longer in control. They had no weapons, no orders to follow, only survival. And now, in this strange place, there was something else too, a sense of quiet dread. The holidays were approaching, yet here they were, separated from their families, from everything they had known, in a place that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. As the women settled into their new surroundings, they tried to comfort each other. The shadow of Christmas loomed large, and for a brief moment, each woman held on to a shred of hope, the hope that, perhaps despite everything, they might find some semblance of peace in this foreign captivity. But the war had stolen so much already. Would it even allow them this small solace? Hilda stared out the small window, her breath fogging up the glass. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the camp. The night was coming, and with it, another cold, uncertain day. But for now, there was only one thought in Hilda's mind. They would endure. The barracks were cramped, with little room to move. Thin straw mats covered the cold wooden floor, and the scent of mildew and dampness lingered in the air. Hilda, Erika, and Magda settled down on the nearest mats, each woman struggling to make herself comfortable in the unforgiving environment. The dull thud of boots against the hard ground outside echoed through the walls, signaling the presence of the American guards who moved with cold efficiency. Hilda lay down, her body aching from the journey, but her mind restless. She stared at the darkened ceiling, her thoughts swirling. It was hard to believe that this was their reality now. No longer a soldier, no longer serving the Reich, just a prisoner of war. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her chest. The sound of muffled voices outside the barrack caught her attention. She shifted her position slightly and saw through a crack in the door that several other women had gathered by the camp's perimeter. Some were standing together, talking in low tones, while others walked aimlessly, their eyes hollow with uncertainty. The air was thick with fear and confusion, but it was also tinged with something else: resignation. Erica, lying on the mat beside her, turned her head and whispered, "Do you think we'll be here for long?" Hilda closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise. "I don't know," she replied softly, "but we will have to make it through. That's the only thing we can do." Magda, the youngest of their group, shifted uneasily. She hadn't spoken much since their arrival, but Hilda knew she was frightened. It was a fear that showed in her wide eyes, her restless movements, and the tight grip she had on her few belongings. Magda had been just a girl when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, too young to understand the full weight of what was at stake. Now she was a prisoner, just like the rest of them. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of boots and distant voices outside. Hilda's thoughts turned inward again. They had no idea what would come next. The women had been brought to this camp not as soldiers, but as a sort of afterthought, caught in the chaos of a war that was now spiraling to an end. Would they be sent back to Germany once the war was over, or would they be treated as something less than human, left to rot in captivity? The thought of returning to Germany was unsettling. The country was already in ruins. The war had stolen everything from them: families, homes, hope. Even the idea of going back felt like an impossible choice. As the hours passed, Hilda could feel her resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with dignity. They all would. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she would not break. Not here, not now. The thought lingered in her mind as sleep eventually claimed her, but not before the final thought settled in her heart. This was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of monotonous routines. The American guards were efficient but distant, maintaining a cold professionalism that made the camp feel more like a factory than a prison. Every morning the prisoners were marched out into the open yard for roll call, and every evening they were herded back into the barracks. The women were given little to do, and what little work they did was demeaning. Most of the tasks involved cleaning the grounds or sorting through supplies that had been confiscated from other prisoners. There was no time for anything else. Hilda kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. She had learned early on that it was best not to draw attention to herself. The guards were unpredictable, their moods shifting with the weather. Some were brusque and harsh, while others seemed indifferent to the women's presence. It was the moments of indifference that bothered Hilda the most. There was something terrifying about being invisible, about being reduced to nothing more than a name on a list. Erica, on the other hand, seemed to take every opportunity to engage with the guards. She would smile and offer a few words in halting English whenever one of them passed by. Her behavior puzzled Hilda. She wasn't sure if it was out of desperation or if Erica was simply trying to prove that she could still control some part of her life. Magda, though, remained withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone. She kept to herself in the barracks, staring out of the window when she wasn't forced to work. One evening, after roll call, the women were gathered together in the mess hall for their meal. The food was bland, unappetizing, and served in large metal trays that looked as though they had been in use for decades. As the women sat down to eat, the weight of their situation hit them all at once. The noise of the other prisoners, the clatter of trays, the harsh commands of the guards, it was all too much. For a moment it felt as though the walls of the room were closing in around them. Hilda glanced over at Erica, who was sitting across from her, her brow furrowed in thought. "What do you think they'll do with us?" Erica asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the noise. "Once the war is over, I mean." Hilda took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know. They'll probably send us back to Germany eventually, but who knows what will be left of it by then." Magda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to speak to her. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Hilda nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The idea of returning to a shattered Germany was a daunting one. What would they return to? A broken country, divided and lost, with no family to go back to for some of them. They were strangers to their own land now. The meal ended in silence, the tension between them thick in the air. The days turned to weeks, each one blending into the next. The monotony of the camp began to wear on the women. They were tired, frustrated, and growing desperate for any sign of compassion in a place that seemed designed to strip them of their dignity. The camp, cold and uninviting, offered little beyond the harsh routines and the occasional exchange of glances with the American guards. But then something unexpected happened. It started with a simple gesture. Private Morrison, a young American guard with a quiet manner, noticed that Anna Weber, one of the younger German women, was coughing persistently. Her face was pale, and her movements were slow, as though even the simplest actions required all her energy. The camp had little to offer in terms of medical care, and Anna's condition was only getting worse. Without being asked, Morrison approached her during a work detail. He had brought an extra blanket from the supply tent, and he offered it to her without any fanfare. The act itself was small, but for Anna it felt like a lifeline. She looked at him in surprise, her blue eyes wide with confusion. She had been told that American soldiers were ruthless, that they showed no mercy to their enemies. But here was this young man, no older than her brother, offering her warmth in a place that had so far offered nothing but coldness. Anna took the blanket without a word, but the look in her eyes said everything. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had treated her like something more than just an enemy. A small act of kindness, but it left a mark. It was the beginning of something Anna could not yet understand, but something that would begin to challenge everything she had been taught about the enemy. Private Morrison's gesture did not go unnoticed. The other women began to talk, and soon word of his kindness spread through the camp like wildfire. It was strange, but it was also the first real human connection any of them had experienced since their capture. For the first time, the women began to feel like individuals again, rather than just numbers on a list. A few days later, Anna found herself waiting outside the barracks, her cough still lingering. Morrison appeared again, this time with a small cup of tea made from herbs his grandmother had taught him about. He handed it to her without a word, and Anna took it gratefully. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice rough from the persistent cough. Morrison nodded, though he didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Anna standing there, the cup in her hands, her heart strangely lighter. It was a moment of quiet humanity in a place that had been stripped of it, and for the first time in weeks, Anna allowed herself to believe that perhaps there was something more to this war than hatred and suffering. As December deepened, the air grew even colder, and the days grew shorter. The barracks, already harsh and uncomfortable, seemed to sink further into the gloom of winter. The women, while still divided by their own private fears, were starting to settle into a grim routine. But as Christmas approached, something unexpected began to stir within the camp. A slight shift in the atmosphere, a strange feeling of anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. The American soldiers, despite their stern faces and stoic demeanor, began to prepare for the holiday. A small tree appeared in the mess hall, its sparse branches decorated with bits of tinsel and odd ornaments, a stark contrast to the imposing gray surroundings of the camp. Some of the guards, in an effort to add some cheer, brought out decorations they had salvaged from various supply crates. The women watched this from their barracks, curious but hesitant. It was difficult to reconcile the image of the enemy preparing for Christmas with the bleak reality of their captivity. Hilda watched the preparations from the window of the barracks, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered outside. She couldn't remember the last time she had truly celebrated Christmas. Growing up, the holidays had always been a time for family, for warmth and togetherness. But now, the thought of Christmas in this foreign land, surrounded by soldiers who had once been her enemies, felt more like a mockery. Erica, however, was fascinated. She had always been more optimistic than Hilda, and the idea of celebrating Christmas, even in captivity, seemed to offer some kind of solace. "Do you think they'll let us sing Christmas songs?" she asked one evening as the women gathered in the barracks after work. "I remember we used to sing as children back home." Magda, who had been quiet for most of the time they'd spent together, spoke up softly. "I don't know if it's a good idea." "After everything," Hilda cut her off, her voice firm. "We can't change what has happened, Magda. But maybe this is something we can hold on to, a little piece of what we were before." The next day, the women were called to the mess hall to join in the Christmas preparations. It was a strange, uncomfortable affair, with the American guards setting up tables and distributing supplies. There was an awkwardness to the whole event, like they were playing at a holiday that didn't quite belong in this place. As the women hesitantly gathered around the makeshift decorations, Hilda found herself standing next to Anna. There was a tentative silence between them, and Hilda wasn't sure what to say. But then Anna spoke quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's strange, isn't it, this Christmas? The world is so different now." Hilda nodded. "Yes, it's not the Christmas we know, but maybe we can make it something different, something new." The day before Christmas arrived cold and overcast, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky, blocking out any semblance of sunlight. As the women gathered in the mess hall, the air was thick with uncertainty, and the usual tension between prisoners and guards seemed to be heightened by the looming holiday. Everyone was waiting for something, though none of them knew exactly what. The holiday meal was being prepared by the American soldiers, who had gone to some lengths to make it feel special. They had even managed to procure a few ingredients that were difficult to find in the war-torn country: canned vegetables, potatoes, and other oddities. The women sat in uneasy silence as they were lined up, waiting to receive their portion of the meal. When the food was finally served, there was an audible murmur of confusion. The centerpiece of the meal was a large, oddly shaped dish, green bean casserole. None of the women had ever seen anything like it before. The thick, creamy sauce coated the vegetables, and the unfamiliar smell wafted through the air. Hilda, always the one to speak up when others were too hesitant, turned to Anna. "What is this?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "It looks strange." Anna took a tentative bite and swallowed, looking just as puzzled. "I think it's beans," she said, her voice uncertain. "But it's so different from what we eat. We never have anything like this." Magda, sitting quietly beside them, leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you think it's special for Christmas?" The women exchanged looks, each of them wondering the same thing. Was this some kind of American Christmas tradition they had never heard of? To them, Christmas meant roast meats, hearty bread, and baked goods, but this casserole, this strange mixture of green beans and sauce, was nothing like what they expected. Despite the oddity of the dish, the women found themselves digging in. They were starving, after all, and there was no point in resisting the strange food when it might be the only meal they'd receive for hours. Each bite felt awkward, unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking the subtle comfort of being fed. Of being treated like human beings, even if it was by the enemy. As the women ate, they exchanged glances. For a moment, the tension between them and their captors seemed to ease. The food wasn't what they expected, but it was sustenance, and it was a gesture of something that resembled kindness. There was a strange shared understanding between the German women and the Americans, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were all caught in something much larger than themselves. Magda, still unsure of the dish, looked around the room. "They must think we'll like this," she whispered. "But we don't even know what it is." Hilda, who had learned not to question small things too much, gave a faint smile. Maybe it doesn't matter what it is. Maybe it's just a way to show peace for today. The strange green bean casserole, for all its oddity, had sparked something unexpected in the camp, a brief moment of shared humanity. But none of them could have known that it would mark the beginning of something much larger than just a holiday meal. The days following Christmas felt strange. The camp, which had once been dominated by the bitter cold and the tension of captivity, seemed to soften just a little. But the softness was only temporary, a fleeting glimpse of warmth in an otherwise harsh environment. As the new year approached, the German women found themselves grappling with something they hadn't anticipated, the constant tug-of-war between their pasts and the strange present they now found themselves in. The green bean casserole had become a point of silent amusement among the prisoners. They spoke about it in whispers, exchanging curious looks when they saw the dish served again, with each serving looking just as unfamiliar as the last. To the women, it was a symbol of their confusion, a reminder of how far they had strayed from everything they once knew. Yet, it was also a turning point. It represented the first time the women had allowed themselves to see their captors as more than just the enemy. The soldiers, too, were human. They had their own customs, their own traditions, and now the women could see that. They had shared a meal, however strange, and in that small act there had been an unspoken exchange of respect, or at least the beginnings of it. As the days passed, the women began to notice more of the small cultural differences that set them apart from the Americans. They had assumed that all soldiers, especially the ones from the Allied forces, would be the same, ruthless, unforgiving, and uninterested in anything beyond the mission at hand. But as they observed the guards more closely, they began to realize that they too had their own stories, their own struggles. Erica, who had been the most vocal about her desire to understand the Americans, began to spend more time with some of the guards, attempting to bridge the cultural gap. She learned a few words of English from Sergeant Roberts, a young man with a nervous laugh, and in exchange, she taught him a few words in German. It was an awkward but heartfelt exchange, one that made Erica feel, for the first time, since her capture, like she was making a connection. One afternoon, as she sat with Sergeant Roberts, they began to talk about their homes. He spoke of his family back in Ohio, the long hours he spent on his father's farm before the war. Erica listened intently, surprised at how much he sounded like the men from her own village back in Germany. They weren't so different after all. Later that evening, as Erica walked back to the barracks, she found herself reflecting on the conversation. The walls of her perception had begun to crumble, piece by piece. The more she learned about the Americans, the more she realized that their humanity wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. They had their own wounds, their own loss, and they were, in many ways, just as trapped as the women in the camp. It was a thought that unsettled Erica, but also gave her a strange sense of peace. Perhaps, despite everything, the world wasn't as divided as she had once believed. The longer the women stayed in the camp, the more they began to feel the weight of their captivity. It wasn't just the physical confinement, the cold barracks, the daily work, the strange food. It was the emotional toll. The uncertainty of the future hung over them like a thick fog. Would they be sent back to Germany once the war was over? If so, what would be left of their homeland? And more importantly, what would be left of them? In the midst of this uncertainty, Private Morrison continued to surprise them. He had become something of a quiet constant in the lives of the women, offering small gestures of kindness when they least expected it. It was nothing grand or dramatic, just simple human acts that broke the rigidity of their lives as prisoners. He would sometimes bring them extra blankets when the nights were especially cold, or a small portion of fruit when he had a little extra. One evening, as the women were sitting together in the barracks, talking softly to pass the time, Morrison appeared at the door. This time, he wasn't holding a blanket or food. Instead, he had something even more unexpected, an old radio. It was battered and worn, the kind that might have been used by soldiers in the field, but it was a treasure in this place. It was an escape, however brief, from the isolation they had come to know. "I thought you might like to hear something," Morrison said, his voice low and tentative. "It's just a broadcast, news from back home, I guess." The women gathered around as he set the radio down. The static buzzed for a moment, and then, faintly, the sound of a news anchor's voice emerged. The familiar hum of a language they hadn't heard in months. English filled the room. It wasn't much, just the daily news, but for a moment the women listened in silence, absorbed by the words that, despite the distance, connected them to the world they had once known. The broadcast was followed by a short piece of music, a Christmas carol that the women remembered from their childhoods. It was Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The tune, even in its foreign rendition, brought a wave of nostalgia over them, a longing for the Christmases they had once shared with their families. It was a soft moment filled with quiet emotions that none of them had expected to feel in this camp. For a few minutes, the women sat in complete silence, the music washing over them. There were no words, no need for them. The radio was more than just a connection to the outside world. It was a reminder that even in captivity, moments of comfort were still possible. The kindness of the soldier, the music, the familiar song, it all combined into something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Hope. Hilda, her eyes closed, let the music linger in her mind. The war had taken so much from them, but in this small, unexpected moment, they had found something they hadn't lost: humanity. And perhaps even in the darkest times, that was enough to hold on to. The Christmas celebration, though humble, had a profound impact on the women in the camp. It was the first time they had been allowed to do something more than the usual routines. For all the harshness of their captivity, there was a brief flicker of something resembling kindness, something that made them feel, for just a moment, like they weren't forgotten. The American soldiers had set up a small gathering in the mess hall, decorated with whatever supplies they could find. A few garlands strung across the ceiling, some makeshift paper snowflakes, and a modest tree in the corner. The tree was sparse, its branches sagging under the weight of tinsel, but it was there, a symbol of a holiday that none of the women had expected to celebrate in this place. Captain Sullivan, a woman in charge of overseeing the camp, made an announcement. "We've arranged for a small celebration. The women may sing some songs if they wish. It's a small thing, but we hope it brings a little light into this place." The words hung in the air, tentative and awkward. What did it mean for the German women to sing? They had come to this place as enemies, prisoners of war, but now they were being asked to share a part of themselves, a piece of their culture. The thought unsettled Hilda. Could they really do this? Could they sing in front of their captors in this strange, unfamiliar place? But before she could voice her thoughts, Anna, who had grown more withdrawn as the days wore on, spoke up. "I think we should," she said quietly. "Perhaps it will help, for all of us." Erica, who had been more open to the idea of reconciliation, nodded. "We used to sing Christmas carols at home," she added. "Maybe it will make us feel connected again." The women, unsure but willing, agreed to perform. They had no sheet music, no practice, no real preparation, yet they stood in the small, sparse hall, their voices trembling as they began with "O Tannenbaum." The song, a German Christmas carol, filled the room with its haunting melody. The soldiers, standing in the background, shifted uncomfortably, but they remained silent, listening. Then, with a deep breath, Anna suggested something that no one had expected. "What if we try singing in English, Silent Night?" It was a bold idea, singing the beloved carol in a language that wasn't their own, but the women agreed, and they began. Their voices, imperfect and unpracticed, filled the hall, breaking the silence of the camp with something entirely unexpected: an act of vulnerability, of connection across enemy lines. The words were clumsy, their accents heavy, but their intent was clear. They were not just singing to pass the time, they were reaching out, seeking common ground in a world that had torn them apart. When they finished, there was a long pause. Private Morrison, standing at the back of the room, wiped his eyes quickly. It was a small, unexpected moment of human connection, but it was enough to leave a lasting impact on all of them. For the first time since their arrival in the camp, the women felt something that had been missing for so long, a sense of shared humanity, even with the soldiers who had once been their enemies. As the new year began, a quiet shift took place within the camp. The immediate confusion and fear that had once dominated the women's thoughts began to give way to a more profound sense of reflection. They had all come from different backgrounds, different cities, and different experiences, yet their time in the camp had begun to weave their lives together in ways they hadn't anticipated. For Hilda, the passing of the holidays brought with it a deeper questioning of everything she had once known. Christmas had always been a time for family, a time for the traditions they had celebrated back home in Germany. But now, in the middle of a foreign land, surrounded by soldiers they had once considered enemies, she began to wonder if the home she had known, if the Germany she had once served still existed. Could it still be home, even after all that had happened? And if it was no longer the country she remembered, what did that make her? In the quiet moments before sleep, Hilda found herself wrestling with questions of faith, not just in the religious sense, though that too had been shaken by the horrors of the war, but faith in something larger, faith in the idea of Germany, in the values she had once fought for. As a young woman, she had joined the Auxiliary Corps believing she was doing her part for her country, believing that she was helping to defend something noble. But now those ideals seemed distant, almost foreign. The atrocities she had learned about, the camps, the destruction, everything seemed to contradict the ideals she had once embraced. Was she wrong to believe in them? And if so, who was she now? Erica, too, was beginning to question her place in the world. She had been quick to embrace the idea of reconciliation, to see the Americans not as enemies, but as people with their own struggles. Yet, even as she tried to connect with the soldiers, even as she shared moments of humanity with them, she could not shake the guilt that clung to her. She had been part of a war machine, part of a country that had waged war on the world. And though she had never been a Nazi, her involvement in the war still weighed heavily on her heart. One afternoon, as the women sat together in the barracks, the conversation turned to their experiences and the choices they had made. "Do you think we were wrong?" Erica asked quietly, her eyes downcast. "I mean, I know we didn't choose this war, but we still joined, didn't we? We still fought." Magda, who had been silent for most of the conversation, spoke up. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said softly. "Sometimes it feels like everything we were taught was a lie." Hilda nodded, her heart heavy. "I think we all feel that way," she said. "The hardest part is not knowing what to do with that. How do we go back? How do we face what we've been part of?" In the silence that followed, the women's questions hung in the air, unanswered but shared. It was a moment of collective uncertainty, of searching for answers in a world that seemed to offer none. The days seemed to stretch endlessly, each one blurring into the next. The winter had not yet loosened its grip on the camp, and the women continued to endure the unrelenting cold, the constant uncertainty, and the suffocating tension. Yet, in the midst of it all, something shifted in the way the women carried themselves. They were no longer just prisoners. Somehow, they had become something more, something that wasn't defined by their captivity. It was as if they had begun to reclaim a small piece of themselves, one that had nothing to do with the war. It was during one of these quiet days that the news arrived. It was a letter, a rare thing in the camp, for the communication between the outside world and the prisoners had been minimal. The women had little knowledge of what was happening in Germany, and even less knowledge of what their families might have endured. But the letter, when it finally reached them, was a stark reminder of the reality they had been trying to avoid thinking about. Their families, their homes, their country, everything had been torn apart by the war. Magda received her letter first. She had been sitting near the back of the barracks as usual, her face pale and strained, when the guard handed it to her. She looked at it for a long time before she even opened it, the weight of it too much to bear. Hilda, who had been watching her, saw the sudden change in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped when she read the first few lines. I don't know what to think, Magda said, her voice trembling. It says that my parents are dead. They died in the bombings. My sister too. There's nothing left for me to go back to. The other women gathered around her, their faces pale, their expressions somber. Hilda reached out and placed a hand on Magda's shoulder, unsure of what to say. There was nothing to say, really. Words were hollow in the face of such grief. Magda's voice cracked as she spoke again. I thought I would go back, that I would go home once the war ended. But now, there's nothing left. No family, no home. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the realization that their futures were as uncertain as their pasts. None of them had known what to expect upon their return to Germany, but now, with Magda's news, it became painfully clear that nothing could be the same. For all the talk of repatriation, of going home, what was there to return to? We don't know what's waiting for us back there, Hilda said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. But we know this. We're not the same people we were when we arrived. We've changed. And maybe that's all we have left now, what we've become, not what we were. The women sat in silence, each of them struggling with their own thoughts. But in that moment, the burden of uncertainty seemed a little less heavy. They had each other, and that, for now, was enough. The passing days seemed to unfold in a new rhythm. While the camp remained an unyielding place of confinement, something within the women had shifted. They were no longer just survivors, merely enduring the harsh conditions. They were beginning to forge bonds, quiet, unspoken connections that grew stronger with each passing day. Perhaps it was the shared isolation or the deepening understanding of one another's struggles, but the walls between the women and their captors, once insurmountable, seemed to crumble a little more each day. For Hilda, the change was most evident in her growing relationship with Sergeant Roberts. What had started as a tentative exchange of words over small acts of kindness had gradually blossomed into something more. He had become one of the few people in the camp whom Hilda could look to for a fleeting sense of comfort. Their conversations, though often brief and awkward, held a depth of understanding that Hilda hadn't anticipated. It was strange, even unsettling at times, but also necessary. One morning, after a particularly grueling work detail in the frozen yard, Hilda found herself walking toward the barracks, her body sore and exhausted. As she neared the entrance, she saw Sergeant Roberts standing by the door, his posture stiff as always, but his eyes soft, almost hesitant. "Sergeant Roberts," she said, stopping a few feet away from him. There was an awkward pause before she added, "Thank you for, everything." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing," he said quickly, though there was a sincerity in his voice that made Hilda pause. "I just thought you could use a little help. It's the least I can do." There was an odd comfort in his words, a simple gesture of humanity that reached across the boundaries of their circumstances. Hilda felt her chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion, one she couldn't quite name. She nodded, though the words she wanted to say seemed stuck in her throat. "Are you okay?" Sergeant Roberts asked after a moment, his voice softening. It was a question that took Hilda by surprise. She had become so accustomed to keeping her emotions locked away, to pretending that everything was fine, that the thought of sharing her true feelings felt foreign. But in this strange place, with a soldier who had shown her nothing but kindness, Hilda found herself ready to speak her truth. "I don't know," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Everything feels so broken. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel anymore. We came here thinking we'd go home when the war was over, but now—" She trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Sergeant Roberts didn't say anything. Instead, he gave a small, understanding nod. It wasn't a solution, but it was enough. For the first time in weeks, Hilda felt like she wasn't carrying the burden of uncertainty alone. She looked up at him, offering a small smile, a fragile but real connection. "Thank you," she said again, the words softer this time, "for listening." He gave a slight nod in return. "You're not alone, Hilda," he said quietly. "You're not alone." The weeks passed with a strange sense of quiet acceptance hanging in the air. The camp, with its oppressive atmosphere and the harshness of winter, was still a place of suffering and uncertainty. But there was a subtle shift in the way the women interacted with each other, with their captors, and even with the world around them. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were survivors, slowly learning to adapt to a life they never thought they'd have to live. Ingrid, once so resolute in her belief that she was serving her country, now found herself questioning everything she had once known. It wasn't just the things she had learned about the atrocities committed by the Nazis. It was the daily moments that made her see the world through new eyes. It was the small kindnesses, the quiet conversations with the American soldiers, the unexpected connections that had begun to blossom in a place where she had never thought such things would be possible. One afternoon, Ingrid found herself sitting with Anna, the two women separated from the others by a quiet corner of the barracks. The mood had shifted in the camp. The women were more willing to talk, to open up in ways they hadn't before. Anna had been quieter than usual lately, and Ingrid had noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the signs of someone struggling to come to terms with their past. She knew the feeling all too well. "Anna, you've been so quiet lately," Ingrid said gently, her voice soft. "Is everything all right?" Anna hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the thin woolen blanket that covered her lap. "I don't know," she murmured. "I just keep thinking about everything that happened, about what we were a part of, about what we believed." She paused, her eyes flicking to the floor. "And now, after everything we've seen, everything we've learned, what does that make us? Who are we now?" Ingrid could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. It was the question they had all been asking themselves, in one form or another, since they had been captured. But for Anna, it was different. She had been trained to believe in the superiority of their country, in the righteousness of their cause. Now, all of that seemed so empty, so hollow. "I think," Ingrid began slowly, "that it's not who we were that matters. It's who we choose to be now." She glanced over at Anna, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "We can't change the past, but we can change how we live from here on out. We can choose to be better." Anna looked at Ingrid, her eyes wide, as if seeing her for the first time. "You really believe that?" Ingrid nodded. "I have to." The conversation lingered in the air long after they fell into silence. There was no grand revelation, no easy answers. But there was something in that moment, a shared understanding that despite everything they had endured, they were not beyond redemption. They had been lost, but perhaps there was still a way forward. Together, they would find it. The arrival of the news was sudden, unsettling, and filled with a sense of dread. One of the American soldiers, a young man named Private Harris, had brought in a stack of newspapers one afternoon. He was more talkative than usual, his face set in a grim expression as he distributed the papers. It was clear that the content of the papers was more than just routine updates. It was something that had deeply affected him. Hilda took the newspaper from him with a quiet nod, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. She didn't need to look at the headline to know that the war was nearing its end. The constant reports of Allied victories and the collapse of the Third Reich had been trickling in for months. But there was something in the atmosphere that day that made her nervous, something that suggested the news wasn't good. The headlines confirmed her fears, reports of the liberation of concentration camps, of the atrocities uncovered in places like Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz. The images, though grainy and unclear, were harrowing. Photographs of emaciated bodies piled high, survivors too weak to stand, their eyes hollow and empty. These were the images of a Germany that Hilda had never wanted to see, a Germany she had never imagined could exist. As the women read the papers, a silence fell over the barracks. It was a heavy silence, one that hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating them all. Hilda felt the bile rise in her throat as she read the descriptions of the horrors that had taken place in the camps. She had heard whispers, vague rumors, but the reality of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had been a part of this country, a part of the system that had allowed these atrocities to take place, even if she hadn't known about them. But now, the truth was undeniable. The war had been fought in the name of something monstrous. Anna, who had been sitting beside Hilda, looked up from the paper, her face pale and drawn. Her hands shook as she set the newspaper down on the floor. Did we help this happen?" she asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. Did we contribute to this? How could we not have known?" Hilda's heart ached for Anna, for all of them. The question was one that none of them had an easy answer for. But in the silence that followed, there was a shared understanding. They had all been part of something far darker than they had ever imagined. And now, they had to live with the knowledge of what their country had done. They were left to process the unimaginable, each of them grappling with the realization that the war they had fought in, the cause they had believed in, was built on lies. And in that moment, as the weight of the truth settled heavily on their shoulders, it felt as if their entire world had shifted beneath them. Magda was the first to speak. "What kind of Germany are we going back to?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there any Germany left at all?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the women sat together, each one lost in her own thoughts, trying to reconcile the past with the shocking reality that lay before them. The realization that their country had been complicit in such monstrous acts weighed heavily on each of the women. Their minds struggled to comprehend the depth of the horrors they had just learned about. To think that the ideals they had been taught, those of honor, duty, and loyalty, had been twisted into something so terrible, so horrifying, was almost impossible to bear. Yet it was the truth. For days the women scarcely spoke to each other. The silence was different from before. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of profound internal struggle. Each woman was grappling with the shock of the news in her own way, trying to piece together a new understanding of herself, her role, and her nation. Hilda spent hours sitting alone, staring at the walls of the barracks, her thoughts swirling. She had joined the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. She had believed she was doing something noble, something that mattered. But now, as she recalled the promises of her youth, those ideals felt as hollow as the barracks she was confined to. How had she not seen it? How had she not known about the suffering, the death, the torture that had taken place right under her nose? Erica, who had always been the optimist, tried to hold on to some hope, but it was slipping away from her. She had thought that by working with the Americans, she might be able to find redemption, or at least the possibility of starting anew. But the news from the newspapers shattered that hope. If Germany, her homeland, had been capable of such evil, what did that say about her? What did it say about the values she had grown up with? Were they all lies? Magda, on the other hand, seemed to retreat even further into herself. She had been quiet before, but now she was distant in a way that Hilda had never seen. Magda, still so young, was the one who seemed most deeply affected by the news. It was as if the foundation of her entire existence had been ripped from under her. She had thought, like so many others, that the war was a battle between good and evil, but now the lines between right and wrong were blurred beyond recognition. The innocence she had once clung to had been shattered. The women gathered again that evening in the mess hall. The conversation was slow to start, each of them avoiding eye contact. But then Anna spoke. "We can't change what happened," she said quietly. "We can't undo what our country did, but we can decide what we will do now, what we will become." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain, but they were a small light in the darkness. The weight of their past could not be erased, but they still had the power to shape their futures. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to give them the strength to face the days ahead, knowing they had each other to rely on. Spring arrived at the camp slowly, its warmth creeping in like a hesitant visitor. The ice in the yard began to melt, and the first fragile shoots of grass appeared, pushing through the ground, determined to survive despite the harshness of the past months. The thaw brought with it a new sense of possibility, a quiet reminder that life, in whatever form it took, would continue. For the women in the camp, spring meant more than just the end of winter. It was a signal that the world outside was changing, that the war was nearing its final stages. The Allies were advancing, and reports of Germany's collapse were becoming more frequent. The prisoners, though still trapped in their uncertain situation, could feel the shift. What would happen next? Would they be sent back to a country in ruins, to a homeland that no longer felt like home? Or would they be left to fend for themselves, caught in limbo between two worlds with no place to return to? Hilda found herself thinking about home more and more, but the idea of Germany was no longer something she recognized. The Germany she had known, the one she had fought for, no longer existed. She thought about the family she might never see again, about the land that was now nothing but rubble. The war had torn apart not only the country, but the very fabric of their identities. She wondered, with growing uncertainty, if she would ever feel like she belonged there again. One evening, as the women sat together in the barracks, Hilda found herself talking to Anna, who had been quiet for the last few days. The weight of the decision ahead was beginning to press down on them all. It was no longer just about surviving in the camp, it was about what came after. The future loomed large, an unknowable mass of fear and hope tangled together. "I don't know if I can go back," Anna said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's different now. I've changed, and I don't think I can fit back into the life I had before. What kind of home will we find? Is there even a place for us there anymore?" Hilda nodded slowly, her mind racing. "I feel the same way. It's not just about where we come from, it's about what we've become. We've learned so much here, about kindness, about forgiveness, about survival. We've found something in this place, something that we didn't expect." Anna turned to face her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "You think we can start over? Find a place here, somewhere outside of Germany?" "I don't know," Hilda replied, her voice uncertain but firm. "But I do know that we're not the same people who came here, and maybe that's the first step." The thought of staying in America, of beginning a new life in a country so different from the one they had known, was terrifying. But in that moment, for the first time in a long while, it also seemed like it might be possible. A new beginning, however uncertain, was still a beginning, and perhaps that was all they needed. The camp was quieter than usual in the days leading up to the final Christmas meal. The routine had shifted somewhat. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, though no one could say exactly why. The American soldiers, though still distant, seemed a little more relaxed as they prepared for the holiday. But there was an undercurrent of tension among the women. The uncertainty of the coming days hung over them like a shadow. For Hilda, it felt as though this Christmas would be the last one in captivity, an end to a chapter in their lives, no matter what came next. She wasn't sure if she would ever celebrate Christmas again, in the way she once had, or if the holiday would forever be marked by the memories of this place, the strange food, the quiet, the shared experiences that had bound them together in ways she couldn't explain. The evening before the meal, Captain Sullivan announced that the women would be allowed to prepare a small performance. The idea was to bring some semblance of holiday cheer to the camp, to ease the tension that had built over the months. There was an awkwardness in the air, but also a kind of quiet resolve. The women knew that this Christmas, for better or worse, would be remembered by them all. As the evening arrived, the mess hall was filled with the faint glow of candlelight. The tree, now adorned with makeshift decorations, stood in the corner. The soldiers had pulled out extra rations for the meal, though it still felt like something of a mockery: canned goods, bread, and the infamous green bean casserole that had become a symbol of their captivity. The meal was simple, but in its simplicity, there was a certain beauty. It wasn't a grand feast, but it was a shared experience, and for the first time in months, the women felt a fragile sense of peace. They sat together, their eyes meeting across the table. Hilda glanced at Anna, who was still quiet, but her expression was softer, less burdened than it had been before. They had come so far from the days when they had been brought here as prisoners, distant, divided, full of fear. Now they were something different. The shared hardship, the small acts of kindness, the long conversations in the cold barracks, everything had led them to this moment. As they ate, they sang. The words of "Silent Night" rose from their lips, hesitantly at first, but then with more confidence, until the song filled the room. Their voices, though imperfect, blended together in a harmony that felt like the first true moment of unity they had experienced since arriving in the camp. For a few brief moments, the past was forgotten, the war, the uncertainty, the fear. All that remained was the fragile sense of connection, of shared humanity. And in that moment, surrounded by enemies, turned into something more, something closer. Hilda realized that this Christmas meal, this strange, unexpected moment, might be the most important of all. The final days in the camp arrived with a strange sense of inevitability. The snow that had once covered the ground had melted away, and the weather, though still cold, had begun to hint at the coming of spring. The soldiers were already making plans for the repatriation of the male prisoners, and whispers circulated among the women about their own future. Would they be sent back to Germany, or would they be allowed to stay in America, to start a new life? No one knew for sure, but the waiting was becoming unbearable. Hilda sat in the barracks one evening, staring out the window at the fading light. The decision that awaited them, whether to return to a shattered Germany or try to build something new in a foreign land, felt overwhelming. She thought of her family, of the life she had left behind, and of the uncertainty that hung over everything. Could she ever go back to Germany after everything she had learned? What kind of life would be waiting for her there? Would she even recognize her homeland when she returned? The others were grappling with the same questions. Anna, who had once spoken so longingly of returning home, now seemed torn. She no longer spoke with the same conviction about her country, and the idea of returning to a place so marked by loss and destruction filled her with dread. Magda, too, was unsure. She had lost everything in the bombings, and now the prospect of returning to nothing seemed too much to bear. One evening, Captain Sullivan called for a meeting with the women. The War Department had sent new orders. It was time to decide: return to Germany or apply for displaced person status and try to stay in the United States. The decision was not an easy one, and there was no right answer. They had been given a choice, but it was a choice full of consequences. As the meeting concluded, the women filed back into the barracks, the weight of the decision heavy on their shoulders. Hilda knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be no simple solution, no easy answers. But there was something else she realized, something that gave her a faint sense of hope. They weren't alone in this. They had each other. They had formed bonds that went beyond their roles as prisoners and soldiers, bonds that would last no matter where they went. Magda, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Maybe it's not about where we go," she said, her voice soft but determined. "Maybe it's about what we do next. We can't change the past, but we can choose what we become." Hilda nodded slowly, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The future was uncertain, but in that moment she knew that they had the strength to face it together.